So, how old is the universe? You'd think that'd be a simple question, right? But it turns out there are two completely different clocks ticking away. And depending on which one you look at, you get a totally different story about, well, about everything. In this explainer, we're going to dive into a source that puts these two clocks head to head.
So on one hand, you've got the number we all know, 13.8 billion years. That's the standard model of cosmology. But on the other hand, there's a much more precise and way shorter timeline, 5,786 years, which the source we're looking at calls the witnessed record. Now, these aren't just slightly different numbers. No, they represent two totally different ways of seeing reality itself. So, how in the world can two clocks be so far apart?
Well, the source we're examining makes a pretty bold claim. It says that the whole 13.8 billion-year timeline isn't some hard fact, but a mathematical guess, a projection that's based on a flawed premise, a premise it calls a broken yardstick. So let's take a look at what that actually means.
To break down this critique, the source gives us a really powerful allegory. It asks us to picture an inspector, a detective, who shows up at a crime scene way after everything has happened. And now he's got to try and piece together the story using only the clues that were left behind.
Now, this inspector's main tool is something called extrapolation. Basically, you take what's happening right now and you just project it backwards in a perfectly straight line. The source explains this with an allegory of a boiling pot. Imagine an inspector finds a pot of water that's cooling down by 1 degree every hour. He does the math and calculates that it must have been boiling for 10 million years. You see what he's doing? He's using the now to invent a story about then. And right here, this is the heart of the problem. The inspector's measurement is totally accurate, but his conclusion is completely wildly wrong. Why? Because he missed the most important piece of information of all, the cook who lit the fire just 2 minutes ago. He just assumed that the process he's seeing now has always been the same, and he completely ignored the possibility that there was a beginning.
And according to the source, this flawed way of thinking, this extrapolation, it forces the standard model into a really tight corner. When the math doesn't quite add up, instead of going back and questioning the first assumptions, the model just invents placeholders to fill the gaps. And this is how dark matter and dark energy are framed here. Not as actual discoveries, but as invisible ghosts that you have to invent just to make the theory work.
And the scale of these placeholders, it's just staggering. I mean, get this. To make the 13.8 billion year model actually work, a whopping 95% of the entire universe has to be made of this, well, this invisible, undetectable stuff. The source argues this isn't a feature of the model, it's a 95% fudge factor that's just propping up a broken yardstick.
Okay, so if the broken yardstick is the problem, what's the alternative? Well, the source proposes a completely different model. It calls it the architect's ready-made world.
The core idea here is something called functionally mature initialization. The best way to think about it is like a video game, right? When you hit start, Mario doesn't have to wait millions of years for mountains to form. The whole world is just there. It's initialized, fully formed, and ready to play. The source is arguing that the universe was created in the exact same way, born as an adult, not as a baby.
This brings us to another great allegory, the tree born old. Our inspector would come along, count the rings on a tree, and say, aha, this tree is 700 years old. But from this other perspective, functional maturity, those rings aren't a record of birthdays. They're a feature of the design. They're like structural bones, created instantly to make the tree strong. So it looks like the appearance of age is actually a sign of a world that was created ready to go from day one.
Okay. But this brings up a huge, obvious question. If the world was created mature and ready to run, then what about the dinosaurs? I mean, where do these giant fossils of these bizarre creatures fit into a young, perfectly designed world?
To answer this, the source introduces a really key concept, a Hebrew term, chelium. It refers to forbidden mixtures, and more specifically, to the idea that a species' original genetic code can actually be corrupted through unnatural mixing. And then the source points to something pretty fascinating, ancient commentaries on the book of Genesis, written centuries and centuries before anyone ever identified a dinosaur fossil. These old texts describe a world before the flood, where the lines between species had been totally broken, a world of just rampant genetic mixing. So here's the bottom line from this perspective. Dinosaurs are not some ancient step on the evolutionary ladder. No, they're the result of this corruption,
what the source calls biological malware. They're seen as chaotic, unstable hybrids from a broken, corrupted world, a world that was then essentially wiped clean by the flood.
So, after laying out its critique of the Standard Model and proposing an alternative for the physical world, the source now turns to its own positive evidence for that 5,786-year timeline, and it argues that this number isn't a calculation, it's an unbroken chain of human testimony. This chain of testimony is called the Mesorah, and it's not presented here as a matter of faith, but as a system of historical record-keeping. The anchor point for this whole timeline, the thing that starts the clock, is a single, massive, public event witnessed by millions of people all at the same time. What's really cool is how the source frames this, using the language of modern tech. It argues the Mesorah works kind of like a distributed ledger or a blockchain. Think about it. You have a public launch event, a mass witnessing by millions of people. The data, the story, is then held decentrally by all the individual families. Then you have these incredibly strict protocols, followed by scribes, to ensure the data never gets corrupted. The whole argument is that this system creates an unbreakable historical signal that's pretty much impossible to fake after the fact. And all of this brings us to the final point in the source's argument. It frames this whole conflict, the 13.8 billion years versus the 5,786 years, as a choice between two completely different ways of knowing something.
And here's the final metaphor, the secret first page. Imagine you find a book. You could analyze the ink, the paper, measure its decay, and try to guess how old it is. That's the inspector's method. Or you could just open the cover and read the copyright page, where the author tells you exactly when it was published. According to the source, trusting the witnessed record is like choosing to simply read that first page.
Ultimately, the whole thing boils down to this challenge from the Book of Job. It's a question about the absolute limits of our own knowledge. Can we really reconstruct the moment of creation just by measuring what we see today? Or do we have to admit that, well, we just weren't there to see it happen? The source's position is pretty clear. Without a direct witness, any reconstruction is, at the end of the day, just a guess. And that leaves us with this final, thought-provoking question. Is the story of our universe something that we piece together by measuring the ink and the atoms and the starlight? Or is it a message with a known author and a known publication date just waiting for us to read it? Your answer to that question will determine which clock you choose to trust.